Thomas Miller had always been a reasonable man. In his 45 years, he'd handled disagreements with neighbors through calm conversation and mutual respect. That was until the Baxters moved in next door 3 months ago. Standing at his kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, Thomas watched with disbelief as 3 children trampled through his carefully tended garden beds. Again, the same garden beds he'd spent the entire spring nurturing. The Baxter children, ages roughly 8, 10, and 12, were making a beeline for where his above-ground pool had stood just yesterday. "Unbelievable," Thomas muttered, setting down his mug with more force than necessary. It had been a difficult decision to remove the pool. After 15 summers of enjoyment, the liner had developed several irreparable tears, and the frame had begun to rust in places that threatened its structural integrity. Rather than invest in an entirely new setup, Thomas had decided it was time to reclaim that corner of his yard for the vegetable garden he'd always wanted. What he hadn't anticipated was the reaction from next door. The problem had started gradually. At first, it was just friendly waves from Karen Baxter and her husband Jeff as Thomas relaxed by his pool on weekend afternoons. Then came the not-so-subtle hints. "That pool looks so refreshing," Karen had commented over the fence one sweltering July day. "The community pool is always so crowded, and the kids just love swimming." Thomas had smiled politely, but said nothing. He learned long ago that silence was often the best response to fishing expeditions. Then came the day he arrived home from work to find all 3 Baxter children splashing in his pool, with Karen sitting on his patio furniture scrolling through her phone. No permission asked, no boundaries respected. "I hope you don't mind," Karen had said, not looking up from her screen. "The kids were dying of heat, and I knew you wouldn't be using it until later." Thomas had been too stunned to respond appropriately. Instead of asserting himself, he'd awkwardly joined them, feeling like a stranger in his own backyard. That night, he made the decision to dismantle the pool at the earliest opportunity. Yesterday had been that opportunity, a rare day off in the middle of the week when the Baxters had gone out for the day. Thomas had enlisted his brother's help, and by sundown, the pool was gone, the components either disposed of or stored in the garage. In its place lay freshly turned soil, ready for raised garden beds. Now, watching the children's confusion turn to disappointment as they discovered the empty space, Thomas took a deep breath and stepped outside. "Good morning," he called, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Can I help you with something?" The youngest child turned around, bottom lip already quivering. "Where's your pool?" Before Thomas could answer, Karen appeared at the fence line, her expression morphing from curiosity to outrage as she surveyed the pool-less yard. "What happened to your pool?" she demanded, as if Thomas had removed a public amenity rather than his personal property. "I removed it," Thomas replied simply. "It was old and needed to be replaced. I decided to put in a garden instead." Karen's face flushed, but the kids were counting on using it this weekend. It's supposed to be 90 degrees. Thomas blinked, momentarily at a loss for words. Had he somehow missed the conversation where he'd agreed to provide swimming facilities for the neighborhood? "I'm sorry if there was a misunderstanding," he said carefully, "but my pool wasn't a community resource. And I'd appreciate it if the kids wouldn't cut through my garden in the future. The plants are delicate." Karen's eyes narrowed dangerously. "We're neighbors. Neighbors share." "I'm happy to share produce from my garden when it grows," Thomas offered, attempting to diffuse the situation. "But my property isn't a public playground." It was as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. Karen stared at him as if he'd just suggested something deeply offensive. Then, without another word, she collected her children and marched them back to their yard. Thomas returned to his house, the knot of tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Perhaps that was the end of it. Perhaps clear boundaries were all that was needed. He couldn't have been more wrong. The following morning dawned bright and hot, just as the weather forecast had predicted. Thomas rose early, eager to begin work on his garden project. Armed with lumber, screws, and a circular saw, he started constructing the first of 4 raised beds where his pool had once stood. The rhythmic sound of hammering and sawing filled the air as sweat beaded on his forehead. There was something deeply satisfying about building something with his own hands. By mid-morning, he had completed the frame for the first bed and was measuring boards for the second when he noticed movement at the fence. Karen Baxter stood there, oversized sunglasses perched on her head, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Beside her stood a man Thomas recognized as her husband Jeff, a tall, perpetually tired-looking man who Thomas had exchanged perhaps 10 words with since the family had moved in. "Morning," Thomas called, setting down his measuring tape. The polite greeting was met with stony silence. After an awkward pause, Jeff cleared his throat. "Karen says you got rid of your pool." "That's right," Thomas confirmed, wiping sawdust from his hands. "It was old and starting to fail. Time for something new." "We were hoping the kids could use it this summer," Jeff said, his tone suggesting this should have been obvious. "Karen mentioned you two had an arrangement." Thomas felt his face grow warm, and not from the exertion of his morning's work. "There was no arrangement," he said firmly. "Your kids were using my pool without permission, and frankly, I wasn't comfortable with the liability." Karen made a sound that was somewhere between a scoff and a snort. "We would have signed a waiver or whatever. The kids are devastated." Thomas took a deep breath. "I'm sorry the kids are disappointed, but I never agreed to host neighborhood swim time. The community pool is only 3 blocks away, which costs money and is always crowded," Karen interrupted. "You had all this space that was just going to waste most of the time." The conversation was quickly veering into absurd territory. Thomas gestured to his partially constructed garden bed. "This is my property. I'm using it how I want to use it." "Very selfish attitude," Karen muttered loudly enough for Thomas to hear. Jeff at least had the decency to look mildly embarrassed. He placed a hand on Karen's shoulder, which she promptly shrugged off. "You know what?" Karen said, her voice rising. "Fine, keep your precious yard to yourself, but don't expect any neighborly favors from us." Thomas wasn't sure what neighborly favors the Baxters had ever extended to him, but he simply nodded and returned to his work. From the corner of his eye, he watched as Jeff tried to guide Karen back toward their house, only to have her shake him off again. "And if I were you," Karen called back over her shoulder, "I'd check the HOA bylaws about those ugly wooden boxes you're building. There are rules about structures visible from the street, you know." This gave Thomas pause. He was well aware of the Homeowners Association rules. He'd served as treasurer for 2 years before stepping down last spring. There were indeed regulations about permanent structures, but raised garden beds were specifically listed as permitted landscaping features. Still, Karen's threat lingered in the air long after the couple had disappeared into their house. Thomas tried to focus on his project, but his previous enthusiasm had dimmed. By late afternoon, he had completed 2 of the 4 beds and was filling them with the rich soil mixture he prepared when he noticed a car pulling up in front of his house. It was Angela Winters, the current HOA president, a retired school administrator with a reputation for fairness but strict adherence to the rules. Thomas set down his shovel and wiped his brow. "Hello, Thomas," Angela said as she approached the fence. "Working hard, I see." "Just getting my garden started," he replied, gesturing to the beds. "Summer planting season is almost here." Angela nodded, her eyes scanning the yard. "I received a complaint about unauthorized structures." Thomas wasn't surprised. "Let me guess, the Baxters?" Angela's expression remained neutral. "You know I can't disclose who files complaints, but I can tell you that raised beds are permitted as long as they don't exceed 3 feet in height and are maintained in good condition." "These will be 2 feet tall when completed," Thomas assured her. "And I'm staining them cedar to match the fence next weekend." Angela made a note on her tablet. "Then there's no issue." However, the complaint also mentioned destruction of shared amenities and something about pool access being revoked unfairly. Thomas blinked, momentarily speechless. "My personal pool was never a shared amenity," he finally managed. "It was on my property, paid for and maintained by me." "I'd assumed as much," Angela replied with a small smile. "But I do have to follow up on all complaints. Consider this matter closed." She paused, then added in a lower voice, "Between us, you're not the first neighbor to have issues with the Baxters. They filed 3 complaints their first week here." As Angela walked back to her car, Thomas felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The HOA matter was resolved, but he had a feeling the Baxters weren't finished with him yet. He was right. The next day was Sunday, and Thomas had planned to complete the remaining garden beds. But as he stepped outside with his morning coffee, he froze. There, spray painted across his newly constructed garden beds in garish orange letters, were the words "selfish jerk" and "Pewol killer." Thomas stared at the vandalism, coffee forgotten in his hand. He didn't need to wonder who was responsible. A child's bike lay abandoned near the fence that separated his property from the Baxters, as if the perpetrator had fled in haste. Setting down his mug on the patio table, Thomas took out his phone and began documenting the damage with photographs. As he did so, he caught sight of movement in the Baxters' kitchen window, Karen watching him, making no attempt to hide her satisfaction. The property line between being a reasonable neighbor and a doormat had been crossed. It was time to take more decisive action. Thomas stared at the orange spray paint defacing his garden beds, his initial shock giving way to cold determination. After photographing the damage from multiple angles, he picked up the abandoned bicycle. It was small, with training wheels and cartoon characters decorating the frame, clearly belonging to the youngest Baxter child. He considered his options carefully. Confronting the Baxters directly seemed pointless. Their previous interactions had demonstrated they were immune to reason. Involving the HOA might lead to a fine, but it wouldn't solve the underlying problem. No, this situation called for documentation and, if necessary, legal intervention. With the bicycle in hand, Thomas walked to his front door and rang his own doorbell. When no one answered, he rang again, making sure the security camera he'd installed last year captured the entire scene. Then, speaking clearly toward the camera, he said, "This is Thomas Miller documenting that on Sunday, May 11th, at approximately 8:45 a.m., I discovered vandalism to my property. I am now returning this bicycle, which was abandoned on my lawn, to its owners." Video evidence secured, Thomas carried the bicycle across his lawn to the Baxters' front door. He rang the bell and waited, aware that his every move was now being recorded by his own security system. The door swung open to reveal Karen in a bathrobe, coffee mug in hand. Her expression of annoyance quickly transformed to one of defensive anger when she saw Thomas holding her child's bicycle. "What are you doing with Tommy's bike?" she demanded. "It was left on my property," Thomas replied evenly, "right next to my garden beds that were vandalized with spray paint sometime between midnight and this morning." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Are you accusing my children of something?" "I'm simply returning the bicycle that was abandoned on my property," Thomas said, "and I wanted to let you know that I have filed a police report about the vandalism. The responding officer should be here within the hour." This was a slight exaggeration. He had submitted an online report but hadn't yet received confirmation of the visit, but the effect on Karen was immediate. "You called the police over a little paint?" she sputtered, color rising in her cheeks. "It's just kids being kids. Maybe if you hadn't taken away their swimming spot, they wouldn't be so upset." Thomas set the bicycle down and took a step back. "So you're acknowledging that your children vandalized my property?" Karen's mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice. "I didn't say that. You can't prove anything. The police will review my security footage," Thomas said calmly, "and I believe orange spray paint is fairly distinctive. If you check your garage, I suspect you'll find a can with matching paint." This was a bluff. His security camera hadn't captured the actual vandalism, only the aftermath, but Karen's face paled slightly. "This is harassment," she declared, folding her arms across her chest. "You're targeting my family because we dared to use a pool that was sitting empty most of the time anyway." "I'm protecting my property," Thomas corrected her. "And for the record, trespassing and vandalism are the actual crimes here, not removing a pool from one's own yard." Karen stepped forward, her voice dropping to a hiss. "You know what your problem is? You're one of those people who thinks they're better than everyone else. Too good to share with the neighborhood kids. Too important to be part of a community." Thomas had heard enough. "Please keep your children off my property," he said firmly. "Any future trespassing or vandalism will be reported immediately. I hope we can return to being civil neighbors, but that requires mutual respect." He turned to leave, but Karen's voice stopped him. "You'll regret this," she called after him. "Nobody likes the neighborhood snitch." Thomas continued walking without responding. He'd said what needed to be said, and engaging further would only escalate the situation. Back in his house, he checked his online police report and saw that an officer was indeed scheduled to come by that afternoon. With a sigh, he poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and settled at his kitchen table with his laptop. He had planned to spend the day finishing his garden project, but now he found himself researching security cameras with better night vision and motion sensors. He also bookmarked the county's legal page about trespassing and property damage. The doorbell rang at precisely 2:00 p.m. Officer Rodriguez was a compact, efficient woman who listened carefully as Thomas explained the situation, viewed the security footage, and examined the vandalized garden beds. "You've got clear evidence of the property damage," she confirmed, making notes on her tablet. "But without footage of the actual vandalism taking place, it's going to be hard to prove who did it." "I understand," Thomas said. "I'm less interested in pressing charges than I am in establishing a record of what's happening. This feels like it's escalating, and I want documentation." Officer Rodriguez nodded. "Smart approach. I'll file this report, and if anything else happens, it establishes a pattern." She glanced toward the Baxter's house. "Have you had other issues with them?" Thomas explained about the pool, the unauthorized swimming, and the HOA complaint. Officer Rodriguez listened without comment, but her expression suggested she'd heard similar stories before. "Neighborhood disputes can get ugly fast," she said finally. "My advice: install those additional security cameras, keep documenting everything, and try to avoid direct confrontation." As Officer Rodriguez was leaving, Thomas noticed that Baxter's curtains twitching. Karen was clearly monitoring the situation. Good. Perhaps the sight of a police car in his driveway would give her pause before escalating further. The rest of Sunday passed without incident. Thomas decided to postpone finishing his garden beds until the following weekend, when he could recruit a friend to help him install the new security cameras at the same time. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and no signs of trouble. Thomas left for work at his usual time, casting a wary glance at the Baxter's house as he backed out of his driveway. All seemed quiet. He was in the middle of a team meeting when his phone buzzed with a notification from his security system. Someone was at his front door. Thomas excused himself and stepped into the hallway to check the footage. His stomach dropped. Standing on his porch were two police officers, and behind them, looking triumphant, was Karen Baxter. As Thomas watched, Karen gestured wildly toward his backyard, her voice carrying clearly through the camera's microphone. "I'm telling you, those garden beds are just a cover. He's building something dangerous back there, and my children play right next door." The officers looked skeptical but duty-bound to investigate. One of them rang the doorbell again while the other made notes. Thomas immediately called home, his number appearing on the security system's display. The officer answered, looking mildly surprised. "This is Thomas Miller, the homeowner," Thomas explained quickly. "I can see you're at my house. Is there a problem?" The officer's expression relaxed slightly. "Mr. Miller, we received a call about potentially hazardous construction on your property. Are you able to return home to discuss this?" "I'm in a meeting 20 minutes away," Thomas replied, "but I can give you the code to my backyard gate if you need to inspect the garden beds I'm building. They're fully compliant with HOA regulations, and I have the approval documentation." The officer exchanged glances with his partner, then turned back to the camera. "That won't be necessary, sir. We can see from here that these appear to be standard raised garden beds. Ms. Baxter suggested there might be chemical hazards involved." In the background, Karen's voice rose indignantly. "He removed a perfectly good swimming pool that the neighborhood children used. There must be something wrong with him." The second officer stepped away to speak with Karen, his body language suggesting he was trying to calm her down. The first officer sighed. "Mr. Miller, it appears this is a neighborhood dispute rather than a public safety issue. We'll clear this call, but you might want to consider mediation services if things continue." "I appreciate that, officer," Thomas said, relief evident in his voice. "I've been documenting everything, including a visit from Officer Rodriguez yesterday about vandalism to those same garden beds." The officer's eyebrows raised slightly. "I see. We'll make a note of that in our report." He paused, then added more quietly, "Just between us, we've had calls from this address before, about other neighbors." As Thomas ended the call, he watched the officers speak briefly with Karen, whose gestures became increasingly agitated. Finally, they returned to their patrol car, leaving Karen standing on the sidewalk, her face a mask of frustration. Thomas exhaled slowly. He needed to get back to his meeting, but his mind was racing. Karen had actually called 911 over garden beds. What would she do next? He had a feeling he was about to find out. Thomas left work early that afternoon, unable to focus on spreadsheets and project timelines while his home was under siege. As he pulled into his driveway, he was relieved to see no police cars or angry neighbors waiting for him. The vandalized garden beds stood as a stark reminder of how quickly things had deteriorated. With a weary sigh, he changed into work clothes and began sanding down the spray-painted surfaces. The damage was superficial. A fresh coat of stain would cover it. But the violation ran deeper. He was halfway through the first bed when a throat cleared behind him. Thomas turned to find Jeff Baxter standing awkwardly at the edge of his yard, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Got a minute?" Jeff asked, glancing nervously back in his own house. Thomas set down his sanding block. "Sure." Jeff stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Look, I wanted to apologize about all this." He gestured vaguely toward the garden beds. "Karen gets fixated on things sometimes." Thomas waited, saying nothing. "I've told the kids to stay off your property," Jeff continued, "and I've hidden the spray paint." He paused. "Karen doesn't know I'm here. She thinks I'm picking up groceries." "I appreciate that," Thomas said carefully. "But this has gone beyond neighborhood disagreements. Your wife called the police to my house today with false accusations." Jeff winced. "I know. I tried to stop her." He ran a hand through his thinning hair. "She's been under a lot of stress lately. The move, my new job hours, the kids' adjustment to a new school. The pool thing just became this symbol of everything going wrong." "I understand stressed," Thomas replied, "but that doesn't justify trespassing, vandalism, or false police reports." "I know," Jeff said again, shoulders slumping. "I'm not defending it. I'm trying to make peace here. For everyone's sake." Thomas considered the man before him. Jeff looked exhausted, caught between his wife's irrational campaign and his own sense of right and wrong. "I don't want conflict with any of my neighbors," Thomas said finally. "All I've ever asked for is basic respect for my property and my choices." Jeff nodded eagerly. "Totally reasonable. I get it. And I'm going to work on Karen. Try to get her to see reason." "I'd appreciate that," Thomas said, though he doubted Jeff's influence over his wife. "Maybe suggest the community pool? It's really not that far." "Yeah, I've mentioned that," Jeff said, rubbing the back of his neck. "She gets hung up on the cost. But honestly, it's not that expensive, especially compared to the HOA fines we're risking with this behavior." A car horn honked from the street. Jeff startled, looking back to see Karen in their SUV, staring daggers at him. "I should go," Jeff muttered. "But seriously, I'll talk to her." He turned to leave and paused. "For what it's worth, I think the garden beds look nice. My grandmother had something similar for her tomatoes." With that small peace offering, Jeff hurried back to the waiting car. Thomas watched as Karen gesticulated wildly, clearly demanding an explanation from her husband. Despite the brief moment of hope Jeff's visit had provided, Thomas decided to finish installing his new security cameras that evening. He worked until dusk, mounting weather-resistant cameras with night vision capability at strategic points around his property. The system linked to his smartphone, allowing him to monitor activity even when he wasn't home. It was nearly midnight when Thomas finally crawled into bed, exhausted but feeling marginally more secure. The new cameras provided comprehensive coverage of his yard, and he'd set up motion detection alerts. If anyone approached his property during the night, he'd know immediately. His phone buzzed just as he was drifting off. A motion alert. Thomas sat up, heart pounding, and checked the notification. The driveway camera had detected movement. He pulled up the live feed to see a figure moving near his car, something clutched in their hand. It wasn't a child this time. It was Karen, unmistakable even in the night vision footage, bending near his driver's side tire. As Thomas watched in disbelief, she straightened up and hurried away, disappearing around the corner of the house. Thomas jumped out of bed, grabbed his phone and a flashlight, and rushed outside. The motion-activated security lights flooded the driveway as he approached his car. Kneeling down, he examined his tires. Nothing seemed punctured, but there was something stuck under the wiper blade. A handwritten note. "Last warning, restore the pool or else." Thomas stood slowly, shining his flashlight around the yard. The childish threat might have been almost comical if it weren't so disturbing. A grown woman sneaking around in the middle of the night to leave threatening notes. What might or else entail? He photographed the note where it lay, then carefully removed it using a tissue to preserve any fingerprints. Back inside, he sealed it in a plastic bag and called the non-emergency police line. "I'd like to report harassment and threatening behavior," he told the dispatcher. "I have video evidence and physical evidence." The dispatcher took down his information and assured him an officer would contact him in the morning. Thomas thanked her and hung up, then sent an email to his boss explaining that he'd need to work from home the next day. He attached copies of the police reports and security footage as evidence of the ongoing situation. Sleep eluded him for hours as he lay awake, replaying the events of the past few days. How had his simple decision to remove his own pool escalated to this point, and more importantly, how would it end? Morning came with no further incidents. Thomas made coffee and settled in at his home office, one eye on his work and the other on the security camera feeds. Around 9 o'clock, his phone rang. Officer Rodriguez. "Mr. Miller, I've reviewed the footage you submitted," she said without preamble. "This is clearly escalating. I'm going to send a patrol car to speak with Mrs. Baxter today." "Thank you," Thomas said, relieved that someone was taking this seriously. "Do you think a restraining order might be necessary?" "It's certainly an option," Officer Rodriguez replied. "Based on the pattern of behavior, you'd likely have grounds. But let's see if an official warning makes an impression first." Thomas agreed, though he had his doubts about Karen's receptiveness to warnings. He just ended the call when a notification pinged on his laptop, an email from the HOA. "Urgent emergency meeting called, bylaw violation discussion." Thomas opened it with a sense of foreboding. The email explained that an emergency session had been called to address multiple complaints of bylaw violations, including unauthorized removal of community amenities and construction of unapproved structures. The meeting was scheduled for that evening at 7 p.m. He didn't even guess who had prompted this meeting. Despite Angela's assurance that his garden beds were within regulations, Karen had apparently convinced enough HOA board members to call an emergency session. Thomas forwarded the email to Angela with a brief note explaining the ongoing situation. Her response came within minutes. "This is ridiculous. Don't worry, I'll handle it." Slightly reassured, Thomas returned to his work. Around noon, his doorbell rang. The security feed showed a police cruiser in his driveway, not Officer Rodriguez this time, but a male officer he didn't recognize. "Mr. Miller?" the officer asked when Thomas opened the door. "I'm Officer Patel. I understand you've been having some issues with your neighbor." Thomas invited him in and explained the situation from the beginning. Karen stood before the HOA board, her face flushed with righteous indignation. "For years, our neighborhood has been a community where children could play safely and neighbors looked out for one another," she declared. "But recently, one resident has decided his personal preferences are more important than community welfare." Thomas fought the urge to interrupt. He'd faced enough workplace presentations to know the importance of letting an opponent fully reveal their position before responding. "Thomas Miller," Karen continued, pointing dramatically in his direction, "removed a swimming pool that neighborhood children had been enjoying all summer. Without warning, without discussion, he just destroyed it. Her voice broke theatrically. And now he's building these structures that are eyesores and potentially dangerous. Angela cleared her throat. Mrs. Baxter, to clarify, was this pool on Mr. Miller's private property? Well, yes, technically, Karen admitted reluctantly. But, and did Mr. Miller ever formally agree to allow neighborhood children to use his pool? Karen's eyes narrowed. We had an understanding. I see, Angela said, making a note. And regarding these structures, you're referring to the raised garden beds that I personally inspected and found to be in full compliance with HOA regulations. Karen's plan was unraveling rapidly. The regulations can be changed, she insisted. If enough members agree that these garden things are detrimental to property values. A murmur ran through the room. Thomas noticed several of his neighbors exchanging skeptical glances. Before we continue, Angela said calmly, I think it's important to establish the facts. She turned to Thomas. Mr. Miller, would you like to respond to these allegations? Thomas stood, folder in hand. Thank you, Angela. I'll be brief. He faced the room, noting with interest that far more neighbors were present than at typical HOA meetings. Word had clearly spread about the drama. 3 months ago, he began, I made the decision to remove my aging above-ground pool. It was my personal property on my private land, maintained at my expense. At no point did I invite or give permission for neighborhood children to use it unsupervised. He opened his folder and extracted several photographs. After removing the pool, I began constructing raised garden beds, a permitted use under our HOA regulations. Unfortunately, my property was then vandalized. He handed the photos to Angela, who passed them to the other board members. Additionally, Thomas continued, I've experienced trespassing, harassment, and threatening behavior. He produced copies of the police reports and the baggage note. All of this has been documented by law enforcement. The room had gone very quiet. Karen stood rigid, her expression a mixture of fury and dawning realization that her audience wasn't as sympathetic as she anticipated. Mrs. Baxter, Angela said after a moment, these are serious issues. Vandalism and harassment are not only HOA violations but legal matters. Do you have any response to these allegations? Karen's composure finally broke. He's lying, he's got fake cameras and made-up police reports. He's just trying to make me look bad because he's a selfish, miserable man who hates children. Jeff tugged at his wife's sleeve, attempting to get her to sit down, but she shook him off. I demand that this board order him to reinstall the pool, Karen shouted, her voice rising to a near shriek. It's the only fair solution. Angela remained remarkably calm. Mrs. Baxter, the HOA has no authority to dictate what amenities homeowners must install on their private property. We can only regulate what is permitted, not what is required. Then what's the point of having an HOA at all? Karen demanded. An older gentleman in the back raised his hand. If I may, I'm Jim Harrison, live here 20 years. Never seen anything like this. He looked directly at Karen. Young lady, that pool was Thomas' private property. End of story. I've got a barbecue grill. Doesn't mean the whole neighborhood gets to come over for steaks whenever they please. A ripple of laughter spread through the room. Karen's face reddened further. Furthermore, Jim continued, I was walking my dog the morning those garden beds got vandalized. Saw a certain young fellow with a spray can heading home around dawn. Didn't think much of it at the time, but now... You're all against me, Karen cried, turning in a circle to address the room. You're all taking a side. We're not taking sides, Angela said firmly. We're establishing facts and upholding our community standards, which include respecting private property and not harassing neighbors. I want to file a formal complaint, Karen insisted, about his cameras. They're invading my privacy. Angela sighed. Mrs. Baxter, I've reviewed Mr. Miller's security system. The cameras are positioned to monitor his property, not yours. They are within regulations. Karen looked around the room desperately, seeking an ally and finding none. Thomas almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Well, I'm not giving up, Karen declared, gathering her purse. If this HOA won't support families and children, I'll find other ways to fight back. With that dramatic pronouncement, she stormed toward the exit, pausing only to hiss at Thomas, this isn't over. Jeff rose apologetically, nodded awkwardly to the room, and hurried after his wife. The door slammed behind them. There was a moment of stunned silence before conversation erupted throughout the room. Angela called for order and addressed the remaining attendees. I believe we've covered the agenda item. Mr. Miller's garden beds are approved, and I encourage any neighbors with concerns to review our bylaws regarding private property rights. Meeting adjourned. As people filtered out, several neighbors approached Thomas to express their support. Mrs. Abernathy from 2 doors down confided that Karen had complained about her wind chimes. The Johnsons reported a confrontation over their basketball hoop. Each story confirmed what Officer Rodriguez had suggested. The Baxters, or more specifically Karen, had been causing problems throughout the neighborhood. Thomas returned home feeling vindicated but wary. Karen's parting threat lingered in his mind. What else might she attempt? He didn't have to wait long to find out. The next morning, as he prepared for work, a motion alert pinged on his phone. The driveway camera showed a police car pulling up, followed by a Child Protective Services vehicle. Thomas's stomach dropped. What new accusation had Karen concocted? He opened the door before they could ring the bell. Two officials stood on his porch, a police officer he hadn't met before and a woman in business attire holding a tablet. "Mr. Miller?" the woman asked. "I'm Sophie Chen from Child Protective Services. We received a concerning report about your property." Thomas sighed. "Let me guess, for Karen Baxter." The officer and Ms. Chen exchanged glances. "I'm not at liberty to disclose the source," Ms. Chen said carefully. "But we've received an allegation that you've created an attractive nuisance that's endangering neighborhood children." "My garden beds?" Thomas asked incredulously.